Some stories decay quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life until something shifts and the rot is exposed. This one begins, as so many horrors do, in a town that believed itself safe. A town surrounded by golden fields and gravel roads where the air smelled of rain and freshly baked bread, and everyone knew everyone else by name. The kind of place where bad things weren't supposed to happen. Fairhaven. Population 2842. It wasn't famous for anything, no landmarks, no headlines, just tidy porches, Saturday football games, and generations of families whose roots ran as deep as the crops in their soil. A place where strangers stood out and the familiar was treasured. And at the heart of Fairhaven stood the Maravails, Caleb and Iris Merrivale and their 3 children, June. Henry and little Clara had lived in the old stone farmhouse just outside the town center for nearly a decade. They were the kind of family people talked about with admiration, even reverence. They ran the town bakery, delivered meals to shut-ins, organized school fundraisers and local harvest fairs. Caleb could often be found fixing someone's fence or jump-starting a neighbor's tractor. Iris taught piano lessons and hosted holiday craft nights for the church ladies. Their children were polite, accomplished, and unfailingly kind. Every Thanksgiving, the Merrivales held a massive community dinner open to anyone in need. Every Christmas, their home was decked out with handmade decorations, and the scent of spiced cider wafted down the road. They fed this town, people would later say. They held it together. But the thing about perfect families in perfect towns is this: sometimes perfection is just a mask, and sometimes the mask doesn't slip, it's ripped off by force. It happened in the spring after one of the worst storms the region had seen in decades. The river flooded the ground, shifted, and something old and buried came to the surface, something that should have stayed hidden. It wasn't a monster in the woods. It wasn't a demon or a ghost. It was a cellar door. And what lay beneath that door would unravel everything Fairhaven believed about itself and about the family it had trusted most. This is the story of the Maravails, the family that fed the town and buried its secrets in the root cellar. But before we open that door together, a word of caution: the horror here doesn't come from what jumps out at you. It comes from what lives quietly beside you. The neighbor who brings you soup when you're sick. The child who smiles as they rake your leaves. The family that everyone loves until the ground gives way and the rot seeps through. The Maravails arrived in Fairhaven in the autumn of 2011. They didn't come with a moving truck or real estate agent. They came quietly, one rust-colored pickup, one pale green station wagon, 3 kids in the back seat, and a few dogs. By the end of that first week, it already felt as though they'd always been there. Caleb Merrivale was a broad-shouldered man with a beard that turned silver early and a voice like a church bell, low, resonant, steady. People said he had farmer hands, all knuckle and strength, but the way he handled dough or tuned an engine was almost delicate. He'd fix a broken tool with such quiet patience it was like he was listening to it breathe. Iris Merrivale was the opposite, an energy, bright-eyed, quick-footed, always humming some forgotten tune. Her hair was always pinned up with a pencil, and she smelled like cinnamon and clean laundry. She had a way of asking about your day that made you answer more honestly than you meant to. Then there were the children. June, the oldest, was already striking at 18. Tall, observant, soft-spoken. She took over the register at the bakery and had a head for numbers that startled the old men who came in for their morning rolls. Henry, 15, was the kind of boy who'd bike across town to fix a neighbor's screen door, then refuse payment. Clara Tin was full of questions, and Mud more at home in a vegetable garden than in a classroom. They bought the abandoned Corman farmhouse, a grand stone relic near the edge of town that had been sitting empty for over a decade. Most had thought it beyond saving, but Caleb and Iris didn't just restore it, they revived it. The shutters were repainted hunter green. The porch was rebuilt with reclaimed pine. The old windmill groaned back to life within the year. And nestled beside the root cellar under the south-facing hill, a garden began to bloom. It started small breads and pies sold at the Saturday market. Then the bakery. Maravail and Daughters opened just 6 months after they arrived. No flashy signs, just the smell of honey oat loaves drifting down Main Street. They didn't advertise, but the place was never empty. Iris made a habit of slipping in an extra cookie if you looked like you'd had a rough morning. Caleb offered store credit to folks who came up short and never reminded them. And every Sunday without fail, they donated the leftover bread and fresh vegetables to the church, to the food pantry, to anyone who knocked on the back door. People noticed. They noticed how the Merrivales never missed a PTA meeting or a town cleanup day. How they hosted fall hay rides for the kids and 4th of July picnics with homemade ice cream. How they knew every birthday, every anniversary, and never let a good deed go unthanked. They were everything you want in neighbors, one resident would later say. Everything you want in family. For a town like Fairhaven, built on handshakes and front porch conversations, the Maravails were more than just new blood. They were a salve. A family that didn't just fit in, they filled in the cracks. And maybe that's why no one asked more questions. About why they never hired help at the bakery, even when business boomed. About why the cellar door behind their house was always locked. About where they'd lived before, and why they never mentioned it. They gave too much, smiled too easily, helped too often. But no one questions kindness when it's wrapped in fresh bread and good manners. Not until it's too late. By the time their 3rd year in Fairhaven rolled around, the Merrivales weren't just part of the town, they were woven into its fabric. There wasn't an event they didn't touch. Caleb repaired the school's busted boiler in the dead of winter free of charge. Iris designed costumes for the annual spring play, sewing each one by hand. June spearheaded a literacy program at the town library. Henry helped coach Little League. Clara collected jars of jam to send to soldiers overseas. Their name appeared on donation plaques, bake sale banners, and community newsletters. They never sought recognition, but it always found them, and the town began to rely on them. When Mrs. Dorsey broke her hip, it was Caleb who built the wheelchair ramp. When the Grangers lost their barn to fire, the Maravails organized the fundraiser. When the flu swept through the elementary school, Iris made broths and teas and drove house to house delivering them herself. No one questioned the generosity. No one wondered why they never seemed tired or burdened or even surprised by need. It was just who they were. That's what people told themselves. And slowly, without realizing, Fairhaven began to lean. They leaned on the bakery when the grocery store ran short on staples. They leaned on Caleb when city workers were too slow to respond. They leaned on Iris when the pastor's wife fell ill and couldn't run the food pantry. The Maravails didn't say no, not once. And because they never asked for help in return, people never thought to offer it. Or to ask what the cost might be. No one noticed when the couple down the road stopped tending their own garden. Iris brings by extras anyway. No one questioned why the local repair shop closed. Caleb fixes most things faster and for free. No one wondered why they couldn't remember the last town event that didn't involve the Merrivales in some way. They were always giving. And the town gratefully kept taking. Dependence is a quiet thing. It builds like ivy, curling unseen around beams growing stronger in the shadows. And while most saw the Maravails as a blessing, very few began to feel something else. A discomfort they couldn't name. A slight unease when passing that beautifully restored farmhouse. A flicker of guilt when taking the extra pie Iris insisted they take for the road. Because deep down a whisper had begun to take root. What happens if they stop? But they never did. Not until the storm came. Not until the ground shifted. Not until the door behind their house opened wide and made the town realize just how much it had leaned on a single family, and how far it would fall when they were gone. For all the generosity the Maravails offered, for all the pies, the repairs, the sleepless nights spent helping others, there was one thing they never shared: the cellar. Root cellars were common enough in Fairhaven. Every old farmhouse had one. Stone-lined chambers sunk into the earth, cool and dry, meant for preserving vegetables through harsh winters. Most were relics of a past when self-sufficiency was a necessity. The Merrivale cellar, by contrast, remained sealed. It was nestled into the slope behind the house, framed by a pair of flowering dogwoods. A thick oak door stood at the entrance, blackened with age, reinforced with an iron latch and 2 deadbolts. No one ever saw it open. When asked, rarely, Caleb would chuckle and call it the last mystery of the house. "It's where the carrots sleep," he'd say, "and where the mold dreams." Iris was more evasive. "Oh, that thing's just for bulk flour and canned goods. It's a mess. Trust me, you don't want to see it." And somehow, that was enough. After all, every family is allowed a little privacy. And when a family gives so much, you don't press too hard on the one thing they keep for themselves. Still, there were moments. Tiny, forgettable things at the time, recalled later with unease. Darrell Whitman, the UPS driver, once arrived early for a delivery. He saw Caleb and Henry returning from the cellar, wheeling a cart covered in a black tarp. Caleb smiled like always, said it was just a broken cooler they were discarding. "Don't worry," he added, clapping Darrell's shoulder. "Wouldn't want you to see my disorganized pantry." At a spring garden party, a toddler from the neighboring farm wandered too close to the cellar door. Clara, normally sweet playful, snapped. She grabbed the child's arm with unexpected force and said, "We don't play there. Ever." Then she smiled again. But the air had changed. Diane Hartford, who volunteered at the bakery, once needed more parchment paper during a rush. She asked June where it was kept. In the cellar, June said absently, then froze. "No," she corrected herself quickly. "Actually, we moved it. I'll get it." She never let Diane near the back storage again. And yet, these weren't red flags, at least not then. They were quirks, if that. Unimportant moments brushed aside by the warm blanket of trust the Maravails had so carefully cultivated. The cellar was old, cold, dirty, best kept sealed for practical reasons. That was the explanation, that was the story, until the night the storm came. Until the river swelled, and the mud shifted, and the locks rusted under sheets of rain. Until something deep beneath the Merrivale garden groaned in protest, and something older than suspicion crept into Fairhaven's perfect picture. And the one place no one was ever allowed to enter opened itself. It began with thunder. Not the polite rumble that signals a passing summer squall, but a deep, sustained growl that rolled over Fairhaven like an approaching war. The forecast had warned of flooding. Historic rainfall, they said. Stay indoors. But Fairhaven had weathered worse. The townsfolk stocked up on candles, and soup brought in the animals checked their basements. No one thought to worry about the Maravails. Their house sat slightly elevated, perched on the gentle rise of Sycamore Hill. The bakery had sandbags ready, and Caleb, always prepared, had reinforced the drainage ditches 2 days before the first cloud broke. When the rain came, he was seen walking the perimeter of his property, with Henry checking every pipe and runoff trench like clockwork. The storm lasted 4 days. On the second night, the river breached. By morning, the lower part of town was submerged. Cars floated like toys. The church basement filled in an hour. But up on Sycamore Hill, the Merrivale house stood untouched, almost smugly dry. Until the 5th day, at 3:12 a.m. A neighbor, Marcy Dalton, was jolted awake by a sound she could only describe as a cough from the earth itself. A low, wet crack, followed by a shudder that rattled her windows. She looked out and saw nothing, just the downpour and a flickering porch light in the distance. By morning, it was clear something had shifted. Behind the Merrivale home, where the slope of the garden met the dogwoods, the ground had collapsed. A deep, jagged depression had formed, 10 feet wide, perhaps more swallowing the roots of Iris's prized lilac bushes and half the stone pathway that led to the cellar. The door was gone. Not opened, gone. Ripped free from its hinges, dragged down into the earth like prey. The scent came first, a heavy, sickly sweet odor that drifted downhill and clung to the fog. It wasn't the smell of rot exactly, not decay in the way farmers know it. It was something older, preserved, tangy and metallic and wrong. The emergency crews were already stretched thin, but when Marcy, who lived 2 doors down, called the sheriff's office, she didn't talk about flooding. She talked about the smell. Sheriff Hoyt arrived just before noon with 2 deputies. They found the property deserted. The vehicles were in the driveway. A loaf of bread, half sliced, sat on a cutting board in the kitchen. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, but embers still glowed beneath the ash. There were no signs of struggle, no packed bags, no notes. The Maravails were simply gone. Out back, past the drenched garden beds and twisted saplings, the crater loomed like a wound. The remains of the cellar door hung in splinters from the surrounding earth. The stone foundation around the entryway had buckled, revealing a dark opening beneath angled sharply downward, as if something had been excavated beneath the garden for years. It wasn't just a root cellar anymore, if it had ever been. Sheriff Hoyt, a man who'd served 26 quiet years in Fairhaven without ever drawing his sidearm, stood at the edge of that hole and stared into the blackness. Something about it made the air feel thinner. He told his deputies to step back. He didn't say why. They waited for the state team to arrive with proper equipment. No one entered the hole that day, but word spread fast. By dusk, the town was murmuring. The smell, the collapse, the sudden disappearance of the family they all knew, the family they all loved. A few still insisted it was all explainable, that the Maravails had left for safety, that the cellar had simply caved in, that the smell was mold or earth or dead roots. But most just stood quietly staring at the hill, because something had broken open that morning. Not just the ground, but something deeper, some tightly held belief that kindness couldn't be corrupted, that neighbors couldn't hide monsters. And as the rain began again, softer this time, it whispered through the empty garden. Something is wrong here. The state response team arrived the following morning, hazmat suits, ground-penetrating radar lighting rigs, and quiet, grim expressions. They'd been told it was a structural collapse, possibly tied to buried farm chemicals. Old property, old soil, someone had said. They probably stored something down there back in the 40s. But no one believed that, not really, not anymore. The sinkhole had widened overnight, as if the land itself was trying to cough up whatever lay beneath. When the crew descended, it was through a narrow passage cut diagonally into the hillside. Not a random collapse. Not erosion. A tunnel. Man-made. 10 feet down, the structure changed. Old stone walls gave way to concrete reinforcement, careful shoring ventilation tubes. Someone had worked hard to make this space livable, or at least functional. The smell grew worse with each step. And then they reached the chamber. It was roughly 20 by 30 feet. The floor was packed earth coated with a thin white residue that would later test positive for multiple industrial preservatives. Along the walls, shelving lined with glass jars. Not preserves, not canned vegetables. Tissue samples, floating in viscous yellow fluid, labeled in neat cursive. Subject C7, organ 2A. Clara, lung sample 813. In the far corner, something larger, a pit carved into the earth ringed with sandbags. Within it, 12 bodies packed, partially submerged in a brine of chemicals and ice. Not skeletons, not remnants. Whole. Preserved, intentionally. Each body was tightly bound in wax cloth stitched shut along the chest, the mouth. Tubing protruded from some makeshift circulation systems. One man's eyes were opened perfectly clear, as if he'd been frozen mid-thought. Some were fresh, others less so, but none were natural deaths. All bore signs of incision. Some had numbers carved into the soles of their feet. One wore a paper hospital bracelet name smeared but partially legible, D. Kellerman, Ohio, admitted 2016. What horrified the investigators most wasn't the number of victims, it was the intent. This was no accident. No sudden act of madness. This was methodical, surgical, scientific, ritualistic. Someone had taken great care not to bury bodies but to preserve them, to study them. Sheriff Hoyt, standing just outside the entrance, received the call from the lead technician. The man's voice didn't shake. It broke. "I think you need to come down here," he said, "and bring someone who knows who these people are supposed to be." That afternoon, the property was sealed. National news vans arrived by sundown. Fairhaven's name would never be the same. Caleb and Iris Merrivale, once the town's most beloved residents, were no longer missing. They were wanted, and the cellar beneath their home had become a crime scene unlike anything the state had ever seen. The family that had fed the town had been harvesting something in return. When the cellar was discovered, the question on everyone's lips was simple. Where are they? The Maravails hadn't packed a single bag. Their wallets, phones, keys still in the kitchen. Half of Clara's school books were open on the dining table. Iris's favorite apron hung from a nail by the back door, still stained with blackberry filling. Everything suggested they had planned to return, but no one did. The first theory evacuation was quickly ruled out. No calls had been made, no neighbors saw them leave. The bakery hadn't submitted a closure notice. And then came the footage. At 2:46 a.m., just hours before the storm surge triggered the collapse, a wildlife camera, one installed by a conservationist studying coyotes along the edge of the forest, captured movement. 4 figures. A man, a woman, 2 children walking single file into the woods behind Sycamore Hill. Rain falling in heavy sheets. No umbrellas, no flashlights. They weren't running. They weren't struggling. They were leaving, silently, deliberately, as if they knew the storm would do the rest. Authorities combed the woods for days. Drones, dogs, volunteers. But the trail ended at a streambed 2 miles north, washed out by the flood. From there, speculation filled the vacuum. Some believed they drowned, that the guilt, whatever it was, had driven them to take their lives. Others were certain it had all been planned for years, that the Maravails had prepared a secondary escape route, false identities, a new town to deceive. Sheriff Hoyt leaned toward the latter. Nothing about that family was accidental, he told reporters. They didn't forget things. They didn't leave things behind unless they wanted to. I think what we found wasn't the result of a mistake. It was the result of a schedule. The FBI joined the case within 48 hours. The property was searched from attic to crawlspace. Agents discovered hand-drawn maps of the surrounding region, notes on local patrol schedules, and receipts for prepaid cell phones and camping gear. In the garage freezer beneath bags of labeled venison and sealed pies, they found vacuum-packed bundles of cash, over $80,000 in mixed currency. There were also documents, forged IDs, passports under new names, a printed list of towns within a 200-mile radius marked with symbols, stars, circles, question marks. Fairhaven had a star. Perhaps most disturbing was what they didn't find any photographs of the family prior to their arrival in Fairhaven. No baby pictures, no wedding albums, no records of birth certificates or school transcripts, not even tax records from before 2011. It was as if the Maravails had stepped into existence, fully formed 10 years ago, onto the soil of Sycamore Hill. One by one, the holes in the story began to show. The house had been purchased in cash. The bakery registered under an LLC tied to an offshore address. Their reference as neighbors from their old town were unreachable. It hadn't mattered then. They were so kind, so helpful. No one had thought to look deeper, but now every missing detail felt like a warning no one had seen. Interpol was notified. Border alerts issued. The family's photos, once used in Chamber of Commerce flyers and holiday newsletters, were sent to agencies around the world. And yet nothing. Not a withdrawal. Not a purchase. Not a verified sighting. It was as if the storm had swallowed them. But one agent, Lena Shaw, said it best. They didn't vanish, she said. They receded, like a tide. They'll come in again. Somewhere new. Somewhere trusting. And the most terrifying thought, Fairhaven may not have been their first town. Just the first one to dig deep enough to find what they left behind. The cellar was no longer just a crime scene. It was now a federal site. When the FBI officially took over the Merrivale investigation, they brought more than agents. They brought forensic biologists, structural engineers, linguistic analysts, and digital archaeologists. Every inch of the root cellar was cataloged. Every jar, tool, and scrap of paper was logged, photographed, and secured. It didn't take long for them to realize they weren't standing in a place of disposal. They were standing in a place of design. The chamber beneath the garden wasn't a makeshift cellar. It was purpose-built, measured, reinforced, ventilated. It had drainage systems, a rudimentary electrical rig powered by a hidden generator and a secondary air supply. This wasn't just where bodies were stored, it was where something had been done to them. One room contained shelving lined with labeled canisters, chemical compounds, many common in mortuary science, but others not so easily explained. A table made of stainless steel stood beneath an overhead lamp. Dried blood and viscous residue pooled at the edges. Microscopes, a dissected animal heart mid-preparation, clean scalpels. A blood-spattered journal opened to a page that read Vessel 11, tissue still pliable after 84 hours. Cognitive response, none. Need new subject. Lower core temp prior to infusion. On the opposite wall, taped photographs, dozens, showed various subjects at different stages. Some appeared unconscious, others posed eyes open, mouths closed, stitched. A few had symbols painted on their foreheads, primitive geometric shapes in what appeared to be red ochre. Agent Shaw, who had worked cases involving cults and medical ethics violations, described it as clinical occultism. They weren't just preserving bodies, she said. They were experimenting with states of liminality, with the space between death and something else. Many of the documents, found handwritten, meticulously organized, used scientific language laced with spiritual undertones. Phrases like energy must be harnessed, not escaped. Time is not the enemy, decomposition is. The body is the lock. Consciousness is the key. Our job is to redesign the lock. One notebook bearing Iris's handwriting contained full anatomical drawings, alternative embalming formulas, and unsettling philosophical musings. What if the soul doesn't leave but waits? What if stillness is simply a lack of translation? The children's names appeared in the margins. Henry's blend held longer than expected. Clara asks about smell, must teach her vinegar absorption trick. Then came the video. Stored on an external hard drive buried beneath a floor panel, the recordings were labeled by date and subject ID. The earliest was from 2012, barely a year after the Maravails had arrived in Fairhaven. In the footage, Caleb appeared seated beside a young man strapped to a table. His tone was calm, instructional. He explained dosage levels, room temperature, and chemical ratios like a teacher giving a chemistry lecture. Iris stood behind the camera, occasionally interjecting. Their expressions were never cruel, never frenzied, just focused, intent. They weren't torturers. They weren't sadists. They were technicians of something they believed to be important. And that, to Agent Shaw, was what made them truly dangerous. This wasn't about evil in the traditional sense she later said. It was about belief, purpose. They saw what they were doing as progress, as necessary. The victims weren't people to them. They were vessels for a breakthrough. By the end of the week, the FBI had classified the Cellar as a clandestine biological research site. The public, of course, didn't hear that term. News outlets still called it a death chamber or serial crypt. But the agents knew better. This wasn't the work of killers who snapped. It was the work of people who planned. And if the Merrivales had built one such lab in Fairhaven, there was every reason to believe they had built others before. The notebooks weren't hidden. They weren't buried or encrypted. They sat in neat stacks on a shelf beside the Cellar's second chamber, each labeled with simple dates and initials. Most were written in black ink, a few in red. There were 23 in total. 8 belonged to Caleb, 9 to Iris, 3 to June, 2 labeled simply C, and 1 with no name at all. Just a symbol on the front, a circle pierced by a line flanked by 2 dots. FBI analysts assumed they would find codes or perhaps a manifesto. They weren't prepared for what they found instead. The Maravails had documented everything. Every experiment, every observation, every philosophical thought with a precision that rivaled any scientific field log. These weren't rants or diary entries. They were structured, referenced, and footnoted cross-linked between authors. The language, however, was unlike anything standard. A blend of biology, folk ritual, alchemical symbolism, and something older. Something that felt borrowed from a tradition no one could quite name. One passage dated June 2014 read, Subject 2 exhibited muscular twitching for 19 minutes post-death. Introduction of brined saffron plus clove distillate triggered ocular dilation at minute 11. No vocalization. Recommend increasing pressure during infusion to preserve reflex arc. Clara suggested lavender oil. Testing tomorrow. Another in Iris's handwriting. It's not the soul we're holding. It's the echo. The shape of the person remains like a mold before it's filled again. Maybe that's what the old ones meant by hollowing. It isn't about trapping the spirit. It's about keeping the room warm. June's entries were more conflicted, shorter, hesitant. I don't think she felt it. Subject 6. When I touched her hand, it was just skin. No pull, no hum. Dad says I'm still too soft. I think softness is what keeps us human. And then there was the unnamed book. Inside it held a series of diagrams, not anatomical, geometric, ritualistic, circles, spirals, compass points, always centered around the human body, but not in a surgical sense. Each diagram was captioned with instructions. Some referenced lunar phases. Others noted specific herbs, incantations, sound frequencies. Many included placement as in where a body must lie within a structure, or how the walls must be arranged to resonate. On page 47, a chilling phrase repeated again and again in varying scripts and symbols. The root must feed from blood to hold the form. The root must feed to hold the form. When interpreted alongside the rest, a picture began to form. The Maravails weren't just experimenting with preservation. They were building something, a process. A hybrid of chemistry and belief meant to create a container, not to trap the soul, to prepare for one, to build a vessel capable of holding life after death without decay, without loss. They called it reconciliation. Caleb defined it as the act of aligning memory, body, and energy into continuity. Iris called it a kindness for what lingers. But Agent Shaw, flipping through Iris's red notebook, found a different interpretation. The first town gave us failure. The second gave us silence. Fairhaven gave us clarity. We are ready now. If we can keep the flesh intact, the echo will stay. Stay where stay, as what none of the agents could answer. But one thing was clear. Fairhaven wasn't the first. It was the third. It started with a receipt. Buried inside one of Iris's notebooks was a folded slip of thermal paper barely legible after years, but still intact. It was for a hardware store purchase in a town called Marrow Creek, dated October 2006. The items listed were oddly familiar industrial-grade lye, heavy-gauge freezer tubing, 5 pounds of rock salt, a small generator. It mirrored exactly what agents had found in the Merrivale cellar. Marrow Creek was a town of just under 2,000 residents, nestled in a wooded corner of the state's northern range. It had no surviving bakery owned by the Maravails, no public records under their current names. But when agents searched property deeds from that time, they found a match. A family called the Maravails had purchased a rural home just outside of town in 2005. The records were clean, the payment in full. The family consisted of 2 adults and 3 children. No photographs, no doctor's visits, no school enrollment records, only references in church bulletins and garden club minutes. They vanished in 2007. The local paper at the time noted a fire. A tragic loss, it claimed. The home had burned due to faulty wiring and the family was presumed dead, though no bodies were ever conclusively identified. FBI analysis of the fire report raised immediate questions. The temperature of the blaze had been high, unnaturally high, suggesting accelerants. And beneath the ash, a partially melted drainage channel was found eerily similar to the one under the Fairhaven cellar. What disturbed the team most, however, was what lay beneath the ruined house. A stone hatch, reinforced, padlocked. Inside, 3 preserved torsos missing heads, each one wrapped in waxed linen, each one marked with that same circle and line symbol. The Maravails hadn't fled the fire. They had set it. And before Marrow Creek there was Ash Grove. Ash Grove wasn't even a town anymore. It had been absorbed by a larger district years ago, its name preserved only on old maps and the local cemetery sign. Records showed a family called the Merrivales living there between 1999 and 2003. Same number of children. Same pattern of public charity food drives, music lessons, quiet generosity. The final year of their stay, 6 people disappeared in Ash Grove. All marginalized, unhoused, or estranged. The cases were never connected, just forgotten. But Agent Shaw uncovered a strange detail. One of the victims, a man named Julian Price, had been found briefly alive, wandering along the highway 3 weeks after his reported disappearance. He couldn't speak. His tongue had been surgically removed. His body bore symbols carved into his back, primitive, unfinished. He died of infection 2 days later. His story was dismissed as vagrancy trauma. No one looked further. Until now. In every place the pattern held a family with no past arrives. They give, they integrate, they study, they harvest, they vanish. Fairhaven, Marrow Creek, Ash Grove, 3 experiments, 3 field labs. The Maravails weren't fleeing mistakes. They were refining a method. For weeks, the focus had been on the Merrivales, who they were, where they came from, what they built. But eventually, attention turned to the people they left behind. Or rather, the ones they took with them. Across the 3 known locations, Fairhaven, Marrow Creek, and Ashgrove, 29 confirmed victims had been identified. Another 14 were presumed, but still missing. And when agents plotted the names, the dates, the known. Last sightings, an unsettling picture began to form. The Maravails hadn't chosen at random. They had criteria. Victim profiles revealed common threads: transient or isolated individuals, those with minimal family contact, few close relationships, or who were between jobs, homes, or communities. Many had medical conditions: epilepsy, schizophrenia, sleep disorders, rare immune deficiencies, conditions that affected cognition, perception, or physical resilience. Several had reported dreams or episodes before vanishing, described by friends or shelters as lucid trances, night wanderings, or loss of time. At least 5 victims were noted to have experienced near-death events months or years prior. That last point stunned the forensic psych team. They began calling it the edge factor. People who had almost died. People who had stood near the veil. People who somehow had touched something and returned. To the Maravails, these weren't flaws. They were features. Agent Shaw wrote in her report the Maravails didn't see their victims as failures of society. They saw them as candidates. Subjects. Test cases for something that existed between states of being. They weren't abducting at random. They were selecting based on thresholds on spiritual proximity to death. In other words, they were looking for people already partway gone. The implication was chilling. This wasn't about resurrection. It wasn't even about possession. It was about refinement, about creating a body receptive to something else. A body with loosened boundaries, one that remembered the cold and didn't reject it. In a red-lined copy of Iris's notebook, a phrase appeared repeatedly. The soul cannot be caught, but it can be invited if the vessel is prepared. And beneath it, a single diagram labeled Threshold, Compatibility, Memory, Retention in Recovered Hosts, Attempts 12 to 16. The people taken hadn't just died. They had been tested. One victim, Margot Ely, age 28 from Fairhaven, had vanished in 2018. She was listed as a runaway at the time. But inside the Merrivales cellar, investigators found a glass jar labeled Eli temporal lobe, day 4. Her handwriting was also found in one of the children's journals. She hadn't just been a subject. She had been allowed near them. Perhaps even used as a helper until she failed. The implications were gutting. The Maravails didn't just lure in the town. They lured in those who were lost and gave them hope, then cut it open to see what lived inside. It began with a phone call. An independent journalist named Dana Greaves, based out of Vermont, contacted the Bureau after watching a documentary on the Merrivale case. She'd seen the facial reconstructions, read the printed quotes, and then she said 7 words that turned the whole room silent. "I think I've met them. Last month." At first they didn't believe her, but Dana was calm, precise. She had receipts. She'd traveled recently to a rural village called Fallow Glen, a remote settlement known for its alternative wellness communities, organic farming, and near-total lack of internet coverage. There, she met a family who ran a community canteen and herb garden, a couple in their mid-40s. 2 children teenagers. They went by the name the Carter family. The mother, Mary Ann Carter, made bone broth and tinctures. The father, Paul, taught fermentation workshops. The son was soft-spoken and loved animals. The daughter had eyes that didn't blink when she smiled. Dana hadn't thought much of it until she saw the symbol. A hand-carved circle pierced with a vertical line stamped onto the wax-sealed lids of their jars. She remembered admiring it. Old alchemical design, she'd asked. It keeps the memory, and the daughter had replied. The Bureau dispatched 2 agents and a local liaison to Fallow Glen the next day. But the Carters were gone without trace. The home they'd rented, an off-grid farmhouse, was found empty except for dozens of glass jars, dried herbs, and a compost pit lined with wax paper. One of the jars, half buried near the garden, was labeled Vessel 31, Summer Blend, 89% retention. Back in the farmhouse, agents uncovered a journal in a child's handwriting. Inside was a passage, "They liked it here. But it's too warm. The flowers don't hold the same. Mama says we go where the cold can carry the weight." From this, the FBI concluded the Maravails had resurfaced, briefly, under new names, new faces perhaps, but the same design, the same system. Agent Shaw summarized it plainly. They didn't stop. They paused. The implications sent shudders through the task force. The Merrivales weren't finished. They weren't hiding in fear. They were scouting, calculating, waiting. And worst of all, they'd become better at disappearing. With every move, they left less behind. But still, they left something. It was Agent Shaw who insisted on revisiting the medical records. She believed something had been overlooked. A blind spot, not in the places the Maravails had gone, but in the people they'd left behind. That's how she found case file A113 from Fairhaven General. Admitted in November 2019. No identification, no memory. Found wandering along a wooded trail 5 miles south of town. Initial responders assumed trauma. The woman, mid-30s, malnourished, partially clothed, spoke in fragments, often in circles. Medical examiners noted signs of long-term intravenous access and incisions that had healed in unnatural patterns. She had no name, so they gave her one Anna Doe. She remained institutionalized for nearly a year under psychiatric observation. The official diagnosis, dissociative fugue state due to extreme trauma. But Shaw saw something different. The hospital photos showed markings faintly visible on the woman's arms, faded geometric symbols partially healed. One matched a glyph found in Iris's unnamed notebook. Shaw requested access to Anna's recordings, therapy sessions, dream logs, sleep-talking transcripts. What she heard chilled her. The roots are warm. The cold makes the voices stop. He said not to open my mouth because the sound would break the skin. I'm not her. I just remember the place where she was. Shaw brought in Dr. Malcolm Reyes, a neuroscientist specializing in memory reconstruction and trauma-linked cognition. After a single session with Anna, he said something unexpected. This woman doesn't just have trauma. She has layered memory. There are 2 timelines trying to occupy the same cognitive space. Anna would describe childhood events that didn't exist, mention names with no public record, Clara, Henry, Sycamore Hill. But she also responded to Margot, as in Margot Ely, the missing woman presumed to have been taken by the Merrivales in 2018. A genetic test confirmed that Anna Doe was Margot Ely. But her voice, her mannerisms, her personhood were not the same. Shaw noted it in her report. We found a survivor, but not all of her came back. Even more disturbing was a moment captured in a night recording. At 2:43 a.m., Margot/Anna sat upright in bed, eyes open, and said calmly, I remember the brine, the warmth after the cold. I remember Iris's hands. Then she looked directly at the camera, and I remember being held. After that night, Margot's lucidity declined. She stopped speaking altogether a week later. Some part of her had returned. Another had not. The Merrivales hadn't just been studying death. They'd been reaching into it, pulling something back and watching what stuck. And now, for the first time, the Bureau had a living artifact. It was supposed to be a routine grocery run. A junior analyst named Erica Monroe, recently assigned to the Merrivale task force, was picking up items at a farmer's market 2 towns over from Fallow Glen, still haunted by what she'd read in the case files. Then, at a small apothecary stall tucked between honey vendors and soap makers, she saw it, a mason jar, dark red contents, and a wax seal, stamped on top clear as day. A circle pierced by a vertical line, 2 dots. Erica bought it immediately. The label read, Clove Root Preserve, Small Batch Winter Process, from the Carter Method. She didn't go home. She drove straight to the Bureau field office. The analysis began that night. Inside the jar, a unique blend of root vegetables, clove vinegar, and unknown organic stabilizers. Traces of formalin derivatives not enough to be harmful but enough to prevent bacterial decay. Preservatives banned in most food products. And human DNA fragments, non-viable but present. Most disturbing of all, the company listed on the back, Kind Earth Reserve, was not registered with any federal food safety database. But the website was active. Polished, beautifully designed, featuring language about ancestral canning, soul-warm fermentation, and memory-rich preservation. They offered products like memory pickles, threshold broth, resonance jams, all small batch, all sold out. And in every product photo subtly embedded in the design, the same glyph appeared, sometimes etched in wood, sometimes drawn faintly in the background. Agent Shaw ordered the site cloned and traced. The server pinged through 7 proxies, finally terminating in a hosting provider out of Belarus. But the payments, those flowed to a P.O. box in Pennsylvania, a rural town called Drescher's Hollow. A strike team arrived within 48 hours. The box had been cleared out just 3 days earlier. A nearby general store owner recalled the man who picked up the packages quiet, polite, drove a pale green station wagon, wore gardening gloves. He bought canning lids. A lot of them. They showed him a photo. Caleb Merrivale. The man nodded once. Beard's shorter now, he said. But yeah, that's him. The trail was warm. They were moving again, operating not in the shadows but in plain sight, turning their legacy into commerce, selling memory, selling preservation, and the most terrifying thought, people were buying it. Months passed. No new sightings, no new jars. The website vanished. The P.O. box canceled. The house in Drescher's Hollow empty. It was as if the Maravails had slipped beneath the surface again like roots after harvest, waiting for another season. But the agents knew better now. They knew it had never just been about the family. It was about what they left behind. At least 4 other apothecaries across 3 states began selling heritage preservation blends with language eerily similar to the Merrivale lexicon. Workshops using phrases like holding the echo or inviting warmth after silence. One seminar hosted at an alternative therapy retreat in Maine included a ritual involving cold infusions, breath retention, and whispered phrases drawn directly from Iris's journal. When questioned, the facilitator denied any link to the Merrivales. Just old folk practices, she said, passed down through herbalists. But when asked where she'd learned them, her answer was quiet. A woman named Clara said her parents were scientists of the old way. The name hung in the air like frost. Clara, the youngest. She would be 16 now, old enough to teach, old enough to continue. It became clear that the Maravails hadn't just built a lab beneath Sycamore Hill. They had planted a methodology, one part science, one part ritual, bound together by an idea simple and terrifying. The soul is not lost. It is only displaced, and displacement can be managed. The Maravails didn't want to cheat death. They wanted to redesign its rules. In her final report, Agent Shaw wrote, "We may never catch them." But that is not the true danger. The danger is that what they built is now being repeated, by those who think it's healing, by those who think it's love, or worse, by those who think it works. Today, Sycamore Hill is sealed. No one lives on that land. But sometimes, after the rain, the earth shifts, and people say you can smell cloves and see a faint light under the soil, as if something remembered how to breathe and is waiting.